Hi there, I'm Lisa Fink. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Oregon in Environmental Sciences Studies and Policy. My dissertation project, titled Unsettled Ecologies, Alienated Species, Indigenous Restoration, and U.S. Empire in a Time of Climate Chaos, investigates the relationship between environmental conservation discourses of species invasion and the racialization of immigrants in the United States. I teach courses in environmental justice and cultural studies, help coordinate the University of Oregon's Food Studies program, and am an assistant editor of the University of Oregon's environmental humanities journal, the Ecotone. My academic writing has been published in the journal Humanities, and I also serve as ASLE's junior graduate student liaison. I'm going to present my paper titled Alienated Species, Migration, and Kincentric Ecology in Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. As Zoe Todd explained in a Twitter thread earlier this year, Indigenous scholarship offers a long genealogy of Indigenous critiques of science, including Kyle Powys-White's work on traditional ecological knowledges, Kim Tallbear's work on race and DNA technology, and Todd's own analysis of the Anthropocene concept. Examining the discipline of ecology, Indigenous scholars have introduced key concepts with implications for Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, including in regard to land management. For example, the biocultural concept of kincentric ecology that Enrique Salmon, Aramari Tarahumara, theorizes as follows, quote, Indigenous people view both themselves and nature as part of an extended ecological family that shares ancestry and origins. It is an awareness that life in any environment is viable only when humans view the life surrounding them as kin. The kin, or relatives, include all the natural elements of an ecosystem, end quote. Kincentric ecology describes a kinship-based land ethic rooted in relationality, reciprocity, and responsibility. Indigenous environmental sciences scholar Nicholas J. Rio Ojibwe applies Salmon's concept to his investigation of invasion ecology and invasive species land management with the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians in northern Michigan, finding that the Western colonial approach to these species constitutes a, quote, invasive land ethic, unquote, that includes the, quote, imposition of Euro-American property ownership regimes, command and control forms of environmental management, and a worldview predicated on the separation of people from nature, unquote. Rio et al. 2017 call for future work that helps us see how introduced species fit into Indigenous cosmologies, asking, in Indigenous communities where local plants and animals are thought of as part of your extended family, how do you respond to newly introduced species, especially if they somewhat aggressively take over habitat of the long-standing plant and animal members of your community? In other words, what does a kincentric ecology of invasive species looks like? Or if none exists, how could such an understanding be cultivated? This paper looks at Robin Wall Kimmerer's 2013 collection of essays, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants as a case study of Anishinaabe ecological thought in order to explore Rio's questions. Braiding Sweetgrasses discusses braiding traditional ecological knowledge with both Western colonial science and the knowledge systems of plants. Kimmerer, a plant ecologist, investigates what counts as inquiry in these different arenas of knowledge production. I argue that braiding sweetgrass also helps us better understand the possibilities of a kincentric ecology of species considered invasive, particularly as it relates to species, place, and ideas of belonging, including national belonging, in the context of US settler colonialism. These possibilities are visible in Kimmerer's recitation of Potawatomi cosmology as an immigration story, her examinations of settler relations to place, and her portrayal of species as immigrants, in which there are immigrants whose behavior should be emulated and those whose should not. While I focus on the possibility of a concentric ecology of species considered invasive, this is not to downplay the impacts of such species, whom I refer to as alienated species rather than invasive, in order to highlight the role of US settler colonialism and racial capitalism in the presence of these species in the US. Alienated species cause environmental changes that significantly impact tribal nations' access to fresh foods and engagement in cultural practices, among other impacts. I focus instead on ecological belonging and how to respond to new arrivals, including those who may be especially successful at adapting to their new habitats. Like Daniel Heath Justice, Cherokee, I believe that, quote, the study of Indigenous writing offers us something different from the vitally important historical and political work in Indigenous studies, a complementary but distinctive way of thinking about Indigenous belonging, identities, and relationships. Thus, I read Kimmerer's essays for what they reveal about a concentric ecology for both the human and other than human world. This paper is part of a larger project that traces environmental thinking about alienated species from Western colonial, Indigenous, and anti-imperialist immigrant perspectives within the context of US settler colonialism, immigration, and climate change. Applying a multi-species approach, the project promises to propose a more capacious ethic and politics that considers both human and other than human beings in a world marked by increasingly unstable climatic and economic conditions. With this project, I identify a racial discourse of invasion, explaining genealogically how white settlers apply this discourse to tribal nations, immigrants, and species, and how it signals specific relations to land and ideas of belonging. Through a case study of so-called Asian carp, I examine how racial and settler colonial logics undergird Western colonial perspectives on alienated species, a topic neglected in environmental humanities scholarship. Dialectically, I investigate how Indigenous approaches suggest a form of conservation based on relationality, reciprocity, and responsibility rather than exclusion. This paper focuses on this second intervention. Third, I explore how anti-imperialist immigrant approaches evidenced in multi-ethnic US literature reveal connections between Indigenous dispossession and the US foreign policy that impels immigrants to the US. Scholars have largely overlooked non-European responses to alienated species, but I found that responses emerging out of Indigenous, specifically Anishinaabe, and non-European settler communities do important culture shifting work around human-nature interaction and notions of belonging for both Indigenous rematriation and immigrant organizing. I turn now to the theoretical basis for much of my analysis. Migration is a central analytic for Anishinaabe cosmologies. In X marks native signatures of ascent, Scott Richard Lyons, Ojibwe, and Dakota articulates the importance of migration in the Anishinaabe worldview, explaining that, per this view, migration produces difference or diversity. Lyons's theorization of the Anishinaabe sense of migration as producing difference points toward emergence, namely the emergence of, quote, new communities, new peoples, new ways of living, new sacred food, new stories, and new ceremony, unquote. Since Indian time, as Lyons describes it, always looks to both the past and future, quote, the old never dies, it just gets supplemented by the new, unquote. He analyzes the X mark, Native peoples marks on treaties to consider Native assent to the new, including concepts, policies, technologies, and ideas that can lead to good outcomes, even though they are not traditional. In this context, newcomers present opportunities for the emergence of relationships that may, as Lyons puts it, turn out all right. Like Lyons, I focus on Anishinaabe ontoepistemology, or being knowing, as Watts describes it. As Todd remarked in her Twitter thread about braiding Sweetgrass, though thought is, quote, thought is co-created in and with place, unquote. As a result, the case study I present of Potawatomi-specific onto-epistemology cannot be applied to all tribal nations, all places, or all species. It is not a pan-Potawatomi or pan-Anishinaabe position. Rather, it is a place-specific way of being knowing and cannot be forced onto all Indigenous contexts. Braiding Sweetgrass through the lens of migration reveals that belonging is based on emerging relationships and the everyday practices that shape and are shaped by those relations. For example, Braiding Sweetgrass frames Anishinaabe cosmology, in particular Potawatomi cosmology, as an immigration story in which the original people migrated to Turtle Island from somewhere else. And this story offers a place to imagine a concentric ecology of alienated species while revealing ideas of place and belonging. Cosmologies, often conveyed through creation stories, are accounts of origins of an ordered world or universe. As Kimmerer notes, cosmologies act as, quote, a source of identity and orientation to the world, unquote, meaning that people use their creation stories as a guide for how to be in the world in relation to other beings. Creation stories help us determine our positions relative to others, which guides how we behave in relation to them. Kimmerer maintains that these stories provide instructions that, quote, are like a compass. They provide an orientation, but not a map, unquote. For example, in the Potawatomi creation story of Sky Woman, quote, fell like a maple seed, unquote, from the sky world into the dark water of a new world in which geese, loons, otters, swans, beavers, fish such as sturgeon, muskrat, and turtle helped to ease her entry. Turtle, in particular, offered his back for her to land and rest on, and on his back is where she placed her seeds, gifts she had brought from the sky world, in a bit of mud that grew and grew into Turtle Island, the Anishinaabe name for their home. Turtle Island grew as Sky Woman danced on it in gratitude. Kimmerer emphasizes that, quote, the original woman was herself an immigrant, unquote, who learns her orientation to the world, the ethical prescriptions for being in the world that Kimmerer refers to as original instructions from the animals and plants that were in this place when she arrived. Kimmerer explicitly stresses that Sky Woman was an immigrant, the original immigrant, and that this impacts the way in which she engages with other beings and the land, how she enters into relation with them, and what relations emerge between them. For Kimmerer, to be an immigrant suggests a particular orientation to the land, marked by humility and gratitude, though she notes that not all immigrants, for example, European settlers, adopt this approach. However, in Potawatomi cosmology, as Kimmerer relates it, the immigrant Sky Woman practices humility and gratitude, which engenders reciprocity as a correct approach to a new place in which one wants to make a home. This approach is both spiritual and material. Kimmerer describes Sky Woman as a good guest because she, quote, had not come empty-handed, unquote. She brought fruits and seeds from all kinds of plants, which she scattered onto the new ground and carefully tended each one, unquote. We might understand the plants that grew from these plants and seeds as introduced species. Reading the Potawatomi creation story, Kimmerer presents an ethical way of entering into relation with those who have come before. This way is context dependent and depends on the land and the original inhabitants. The ethical way of entering into relation is received from the land and the original inhabitants by listening, watching, and noticing. Situating alienated species, or those considered invasive, within a cosmology based on an immigrant story emphasizes the movement of plants, animals, and people is not inherently bad and instead opens new possibilities, or may open new possibilities. Extending the Anishinaabe value of migration to plant and animal nations means that their migrations are not considered inherently negative or inherently positive. In this creation story, no one is inherently excluded from belonging. It is not other beings from elsewhere merely because they are from elsewhere. Sky Woman is not treated as an outsider, but as a guest who may make this place her home. In this way, Sky Woman learns not only how to make a home in this place from the animals and plants who already dwell there, but also how to treat guests with mutual respect and openness. In such a framework, an alienated species is a guest that one approaches with the openness of curiosity. The animals and plants respond to Sky Woman as though she were a refugee, seeking to offer her a place to rest and then live, engaging in acts of reciprocity with her. They provide land, she provides seeds, and a dance of gratitude. She is not allowed to die or made to die because she comes from elsewhere. Land management using this approach would welcome alienated species with gifts and with listening and watching for the gifts the alienated species have brought. As a bearer of the key value of migration, Potawatomi cosmology as an immigration story opens possibilities for considering plant and animal migrations as producing diversity and new relationships, new potential foods, new sacred rituals. In short, emerging relations that require an orientation of gratitude, humility, curiosity, and patience. This orientation enables emerging relations with plants, even displaced and alienated plants considered invasive. Kimmerer suggests as much in the short story Defeating Wendigo, in which a woman harvests the dark blue berries of the buckthorn, a plant considered invasive, and engages its medicinal uses in order to vanquish the legendary Wendigo, a symbolic monster of greed. The story speaker describes the buckthorn as, quote, a rampant invader of disturbed places, unquote, signaling that the agency of the buckthorn is not the only factor in its success on Turtle Island. Rather, the land was already disturbed, which enables buckthorn's ability to take root. But this woman has more to say about this powerful plant. Quote, it takes over the forest, starving other plants of light and space. Buckthorn also poisons the soil, preventing the growth of any species but itself, creating a floristic desert. You have to acknowledge that it's a winner in the free market, a success story built on efficiency, monopoly, and the creation of scarcity. It is a botanical imperialist stealing land from the native species, unquote. Like Western colonial discourse, the woman in the story characterizes the buckthorn as the group of humans she most maligns. In Western colonial US discourse, which I study elsewhere, it is non-white immigrants who are characterized as invasive. For Kimmerer, however, it is neoliberals and colonizers. However, from the Anishinaabe perspective, buckthorn is a plant nation with its own purpose and fulfillment, its own original instructions to live and thrive, and to enter into relationship with the buckthorn means to learn its uses. Kimmerer presents this perspective by detailing the uses of buckthorn. Quote, a small dose of buckthorn is a laxative, a strong dose is a purgative, and a whole kettle, which the Wendigo in her story greedily gulps down, an emetic, which induces vomiting. The buckthorn, which the story's speaker described as an invader akin to settlers and capitalist imperialists, provides a medicine gift that helps the speaker defeat and, more importantly, heal the Wendigo. Having drank the entire kettle of buckthorn tea, the Wendigo, quote, vomits up coins and coal slurry, clumps of sawdust from her woods, clots of tar sand, and the little bones of birds. He spews solvay waste, gags on an entire oil slick, unquote. The woman in the story follows the buckthorn tea with additional plant medicines that she gives to the Wendigo, including willow, strawberries, corn, beans, squash, and wild leeks, witch hazel, cedars, silver bells, and maple, as well as story medicine with Sky Woman's immigrant tale. Buckthorn is part of the medicine that subdues and soothes the Wendigo. The woman in the Defeating Wendigo tale acknowledges that, quote, she may not know what to do to defeat the Wendigo, but the plants do, giving of their medicine gifts as they always do to sustain the world. In this story, buckthorn is one of the plants with knowledge and medicine gifts to share. In order to partake of the buckthorn's knowledge and its medicine gifts, the woman must have intimacy with the buckthorn, and she must engage with it through harvesting. If the buckthorn had been eradicated, its powerful medicine would not have been available for her to use in defeating the Wendigo. Kimmerer's story suggests that even this hated plant has beneficial uses with a role to play. Though buckthorn overtakes long-standing plant communities with whom the woman has important relationships, it also offers its own medicine gifts. The story suggests that relationships of curiosity and collaboration with alienated plants might provide understanding of the knowledge and gifts they offer as a way of enlarging the circle of nations with whom one might have kinship relations. With migration as a key analytic, Anishinaabe conceptions of belonging open up possibilities of a concentric ecology of alienated species. To conclude, I want to briefly mention a few of the limitations for a concentric ecology of such species that I locate in Braiding Sweetgrass. I identify two such limitations. First, Kimmerer often resorts to the language of invasion and exclusion when referring to alienated species. This makes sense given her training in Western colonial institutions. However, such language reinforces the native invasive binary that arises out of Western colonial thinking. White nativists use this binary as a racial script, to use a term offered by Natalia Molina, against both alienated species and human groups constructed as invasive, including other tribal nations and communities, as well as Mexican migrants, Central American migrants, and Black migrants, to name a few. Lyons argues that reinforcing such binaries limits what can be said and what can be known about a particular topic. Maintaining the colonial native invasive binary also limits what can be said and known, and I add what can be asked about species placed into one of these two categories. Further, relying on the native invasive binary reinforces a colonial designation, native, that it obscures important differences between tribal nations and communities in their place thought and onto epistemologies. Second, and relatedly, Kimmerer likens alienated species to settlers. While this makes clear that settlers are the invaders, historicizing and denaturalizing the Western colonial racial discourse of invasion, it obscures the role of human agency in these species displacements. Most species introductions are anthropogenic, and since the 15th century are particularly related to European colonialism, including US settler colonialism, and through global racial extractive capitalism. Alienated species are not so much invasive, meaning purposefully taking over another's territory, as they are following their original instructions in the place to which they were displaced. I will be happy to elaborate on these limitations and any other aspect of this paper in our synchronous Q&A on August 5th during the conference. Thanks so much for watching.